Elena adjusted her glasses and squinted at the invitation. The handwriting was precise, almost mechanical. For the betterment of history, we cordially invite you to witness the truth of the past. It came with a plane ticket and a disclaimer that read like a parody of a sci-fi movie. No interference, no disclosure, and absolutely no corruption of historical integrity. As a historian, she found the wording pretentious. As a cynic, she found it hilarious. "They want me to watch history burn and call it research," she muttered, tossing the envelope onto her cluttered desk. Yet something gnawed at her, curiosity, that persistent parasite. A week later, Elena sat in a sterile briefing room that felt more like a dentist's office than a gateway to time travel. Across from her sat a man named Dr. Harker, who had the personality of a doorstop and the ethics of a used car salesman. "Your task," he began, adjusting his tie, "is to observe, document, and report. Do not engage. Your presence must remain an invisible thread in the tapestry of time." "Right, because tampering with history is bad," Elena quipped, "unless you're a billionaire with a space program." Harker didn't smile. She decided then that he wasn't human. The mission was straightforward. Witness the infamous orphanage fire of 1840 in Pennsylvania, a tragedy that killed 32 children. The fire had been attributed to an act of God in the official record. Locals, however, whispered about curses and witchcraft. "Why this event?" Elena asked. "Why not something sexy like Lincoln's assassination or the sinking of the Titanic?" Harker's reply was dry. "The past is full of untold stories. This one is yours to tell." The cryptic answer only irritated her more. Stepping out of the portal was like waking from anesthesia. The world smelled of damp wood and soot, and the streets buzzed with the kind of slow, deliberate activity that defined pre-industrial life. Elena had been planted as a teacher at the orphanage, a convenient cover for her presence. The children were grubby, bright-eyed, and heartbreakingly resilient. One boy, James, stood out, a 9-year-old with a sharp wit and a knack for asking questions that bordered on existential. "If God loves us," he asked her one evening, "why does he let bad things happen?" "Because he's busy micromanaging the angels," Elena replied. The boy laughed, but his eyes stayed solemn. Strange things began happening almost immediately. Elena noticed symbols carved into the wooden beams of the orphanage, symbols that hadn't been mentioned in any historical account. The children spoke of the shadow, a figure that supposedly roamed the halls at night. At first, she dismissed it as childhood fantasy, until she saw it herself. A tall, dark shape lingering at the edge of her vision, always just out of focus. "This place is like a Scooby-Doo episode," she wrote in her journal, minus the Great Dane and the laughter track. Her unease grew when she found a journal in her room, one that she didn't remember packing. The handwriting was hers, but the entries were dated 1839, and the contents chronicled her own observations and failures to stop the fire. One entry read, "I warned the headmistress, but she didn't believe me. She thought I was mad. Maybe I am." Another, "James told me he saw the shadow again. I told him it wasn't real. What a liar I've become." The realization hit her like a freight train. "I've been here before," she whispered, staring at the words. "Or I will be." The implications churned in her mind. If she had already tried to save these children and failed, was she doomed to repeat the same mistakes? Worse, was her presence the reason for the tragedy in the first place? On the eve of the fire, Elena confronted the shadow directly. It appeared in the corner of the room as she scribbled frantic notes. "What are you?" she demanded, her voice trembling. The figure tilted its head, an almost human gesture. When it spoke, its voice was a distorted echo. "I am consequence." Elena felt the blood drain from her face. Consequence of what? The shadow didn't answer. Instead, it stepped closer, and for the first time she saw its form clearly. It was her, an older, haggard version with sunken eyes and a haunted expression. Panic set in. She tried to evacuate the children, pleading with the headmistress to trust her. "You're hysterical," the woman snapped, "and your behavior is frightening the children. If you don't listen to me, they'll all die," Elena shouted, desperation overriding decorum. But the headmistress refused, and Elena's attempts to lead the children to safety only caused more confusion. When the fire started, it was fast and furious, consuming the wooden structure with terrifying speed. Elena fought through the smoke, pulling children from their beds and ushering them toward the exit. But chaos reigned. The older children refused to leave without the younger ones. The younger ones clung to their beds in fear. Amid the screaming and crackling flames, she saw James standing in the doorway, his face lit by the fire's glow. "You can't save us," he said softly. "You're part of it." His words pierced through her like a blade. In the aftermath, Elena awoke in the present, pulled back by the organization's retrieval protocol. Her report was clinical, devoid of the raw emotion that churned inside her. Harker read it in silence before sliding it back across the table. "You did your job," he said. "History remains intact." Elena laughed bitterly. "Intact? I think I set the damn fire." Harker didn't respond, but the faint smirk on his face confirmed her suspicion. They had known all along. Elena tried to move on, but the guilt was a ghost that refused to leave her. Months later, she published her account as a novel, thinly veiled as fiction. It became a bestseller, praised for its raw emotion and thought-provoking exploration of fate and free will. Readers debated endlessly over the moral questions it raised. Was Elena a hero for trying to save the children, or a villain for causing their deaths? In a final twist, Elena received a letter postmarked 1841. It contained a single sentence, written in a child's scrawl. "Thank you for trying." Tucked inside was a crude drawing of the shadow. Elena stared at it for a long time, her heart heavy with the weight of unanswered questions. Somewhere in the abyss of time, the truth lingered, just out of reach, like a shadow at the edge of her vision. Epilogue. The observer becomes the observed. Months had passed since Elena's return to the present, but the weight of the orphanage fire had only grown heavier. Her nights were restless, filled with vivid dreams of flames, shadows, and James's haunting words, "You can't save us, you're part of it." She tried to move on, distracting herself with lectures, writing, and interviews about her fictional bestseller. But something gnawed at her, a sense that she hadn't truly left 1840 behind. One evening, Elena found herself sitting in a library, paging through old photographs. A researcher had invited her to a private exhibit showcasing rare images of historical disasters, including one section on the orphanage fire. "Some of these were just discovered," the researcher explained, handing her an unassuming envelope. Inside was a photograph of the fire's aftermath, smoldering ruins, scattered debris, and a few survivors standing in a daze. Elena froze. Among the survivors was a figure dressed in clothes too modern for 1840, a woman clutching a journal. Her journal. The woman's face was obscured by shadow, but her posture, her stance, it was unmistakable. It was her. "Are you all right?" the researcher asked. Elena nodded stiffly and excused herself, the photograph trembling in her hands. In the safety of her car, she stared at it, her mind racing. How could this exist? Had she stayed behind? No, she was certain she'd been retrieved. And then the realization hit her like a gut punch. Another version of me. Another attempt. The pieces began to fall into place. James's cryptic words weren't the musings of a frightened child. They were a warning. He'd seen her before. He knew me. Perhaps it was in the whispers of the other children, the stories they passed around about a strange woman who had tried, and failed, to save them. Or perhaps James had encountered another iteration of Elena, one who had lingered longer, made bolder moves, or left behind traces of herself in the process. Her thoughts were interrupted by the ring of her phone. "This is Elena," she answered absently. "I've been trying to reach you." The voice was unfamiliar but firm. "You're not the only one documenting the past, you know." "Who is this?" she asked, her pulse quickening. "Someone who's studied your work, both in print and elsewhere." The voice was laced with a knowing tone. "We need to talk. Your actions in 1840 didn't just preserve history, they rewrote it." Elena's grip tightened on the phone. "What are you talking about?" "History isn't static, Elena. Your attempts to observe have already changed the timeline. Minor shifts at first, but they're compounding. Movements delayed, lives erased. I'm calling from 2136, and we're still dealing with the mess you started." Her stomach dropped. "You're lying, I wish I were. But you're not the first, and you won't be the last. You see, time travel is recursive. Every loop tightens the knot. Why are you telling me this? She demanded. Because, the voice said, I need your help to stop it. Someone else has gone back and they're doing far worse than you ever did. The call ended abruptly, leaving Elena sitting in stunned silence. She glanced at the photograph again, her own figure standing amidst the ashes. James's words echoed in her mind. You're part of it. She had always been part of it, a cog in the endless machine of causality. But now, she had to decide whether to step off the wheel or keep spinning with it, knowing every action might only deepen the chaos. Key question. Is humanity doomed to become its own greatest threat through endless cycles of manipulation, each generation justifying its actions as necessary for the greater good? Let me know in the comments for the sequel. Now back to the story. Elena sighed and opened her journal, flipping to a blank page. Her pen hovered over the paper, trembling as the weight of what she had learned pressed down on her. Finally, she wrote, if rewriting history means unraveling the present, who decides what's worth saving, and at what cost? Perhaps it's not the past that needs fixing, but the future we keep running from. She stared at the words, her breath catching, realizing that the answer she sought might require her to become the very thing she feared most.